Have you ever wondered how a landlocked nation, perched among the highest peaks of South America, once held one of the richest silver mines the world had ever seen, and why that wealth became chains around its own people? Bolivia's story begins in the glare of Potosí's silver and wins through centuries of conquest, rebellion, and survival. From the sacred shores of Lake Titicaca to battlefields soaked in sacrifice, this is the unbroken pulse of a nation's fight for identity. In this video, we will uncover Bolivia's complete history, long before the word Bolivia was spoken, before the first sails from Spain cut across the horizon. This land was a high-altitude cradle of civilizations. The winds that now sweep across the Altiplano once carried the voices of people whose empires rose and fell without a single page in Europe's chronicles. Around Lake Titicaca, the world's highest navigable lake, shimmering like a piece of the sky dropped onto the earth, the Tiwanaku civilization flourished between 500 and 1000 CE. To the modern eye, their ruins seem silent, but their stones still hold the weight of an extraordinary vision. Monoliths carved from volcanic rock stand like frozen sentinels, their surfaces etched with patterns whose meanings remain partly obscured. These were not merely decorative. They were fragments of a worldview where gods walked alongside humans, where the cosmos was mapped in stone. Tiwanaku's people mastered life at over 3,800 meters above sea level, where thin air and cold nights punished the unprepared. They built raised field agriculture systems, suka kolus, elevated planting platforms surrounded by water channels that absorbed solar heat during the day and released it at night, preventing frost damage. In a place where the ground could turn to ice in hours, this innovation meant survival. Maize, quinoa, and potatoes thrived in these man-made oases, feeding tens of thousands. Religion here was woven into the daily pulse of life. The sun, the moon, and the jagged peaks of the Andes were not symbols, but living presences. The great gateway of the sun, carved from a single block of stone, bore the image of a deity often linked to Viracocha, the creator god. It looked out across the Altiplano as though guarding the balance between humans and the divine. By the time Tiwanaku's influence waned, around the 12th century, waves of migration and cultural transformation swept across the region. The Aymara kingdoms rose in its wake. They did not forget Tiwanaku. They inherited and adapted its agricultural and religious traditions, each kingdom governing its portion of the high plateau, competing yet bound by shared roots. To the east, beyond the mountain shadows, lived other peoples, nomadic groups who hunted and foraged in the lowlands, far from the stone temples. In the Yungas valleys, lush and humid, communities cultivated coca leaves, a sacred plant that would later become an object of both reverence and exploitation. In the Chaco, resilient tribes roamed dry forests, their survival tied to deep knowledge of the land's rhythms. Then came the Quechua, bearers of the expanding Inca influence from the northwest. Their presence began to knit the Bolivian highlands into a broader Andean tapestry. The Inca would later bring roads, administrative systems, and their own pantheon. But before that, they absorbed and respected much of what the Aymara and their predecessors had built. When you stand today among the Tiwanaku ruins, the silence is deceptive. Beneath the earth, thousands of years of human adaptation, faith, and ambition lie compacted like the layers of the Andes themselves. In these stones is the first chapter of Bolivia's story, a reminder that before silver, before conquest, this land had already mastered the art of survival. It had already learned to turn hardship into ingenuity and isolation into strength. It was a world balanced on the edge of the sky, where every breath was a negotiation with altitude, and every harvest was a small victory against the cold. A world where identity was carved in stone long before foreign hands sought to rewrite it. By the 15th century, the highlands of present-day Bolivia had already witnessed centuries of cultural flowering and collapse. The ruins of Tiwanaku still watched over the Altiplano like half-buried memories, and the Aymara kingdoms guarded their autonomy fiercely. But the mountains are patient witnesses, and they saw another power rising from the north. The Inca Empire, born in the sacred valley of Cuzco, expanded like the slow but relentless advance of a glacier. Its armies moved along paved stone roads, guided by the sun and the will of the Sapa Inca. In the mid-1400s, they crossed into what is now western Bolivia, claiming its valleys, plateaus, and mountains as part of Tawantinsuyu, the four regions of their vast realm. Conquest here was not only the clash of armies, it was the weaving of a political net. The Incas knew that to hold the heights of the Andes, they needed more than soldiers. They brought with them the Capac Ñan, an intricate network of roads linking Cuzco to the furthest reaches of the empire. Over these roads came messengers, soldiers, priests, and inspectors, knitting Bolivia's highlands into the empire's administrative heart. The Aymara resisted, but resistance often met with negotiation, absorption, or forced relocation. Entire communities could be uprooted and resettled under the Mitmac system, scattering potentially rebellious groups and replacing them with loyal subjects from other regions. This policy diluted local power, but it also mingled cultures, languages, and customs across the empire's spine. In daily life, the Incas imposed their economic order through the mita, a labor tax owed to the state. Men were required to work for a set period each year on projects ranging from road building to military campaigns. In return, the state redistributed goods, organized festivals, and maintained storehouses to feed the people in lean years. In theory, it was a balanced exchange. In practice, it was the beginning of a pattern of coerced labor that would later be pushed to far more brutal extremes under Spanish rule. Religious life also shifted under Inca control. The sun, Inti, became the central deity, and his temples rose in newly conquered lands. Yet the Incas were pragmatic conquerors. Local gods, the Huacas, were not erased, but woven into the imperial pantheon. Lake Titicaca, already sacred to the Aymara, became part of the Inca creation myth, a place where the children of the sun emerged to bring order to the world. Pilgrims came to its shores, leaving offerings where the water met the sky. The Incas also understood the highlands' agricultural potential. They expanded terraced farming, introducing new crops in higher altitudes, and built more advanced irrigation systems to draw life from thin mountain soils. In places like Cochabamba's valleys, they developed large-scale maize production to supply the empire's needs. But the integration was not without friction. The highlands' proud traditions could bend under the imperial will, yet they did not break. Underneath the outward acceptance of Inca rule, the memory of autonomy remained alive, waiting for the moment it could resurface. By the late 15th century, Bolivia's highlands were firmly within the Inca fold. The roads pulsed with imperial life, caravans of llamas carrying salt, textiles, and coca leaves, runners bearing messages from Cusco to the far frontiers. The Andes, draped in snow and shadow, seemed to belong to an unshakable empire. Yet empires, like mountains, can seem eternal while still crumbling inside. In less than a generation, the same roads that carried the Incas' authority would carry an invasion from across the ocean. An invasion that would shatter the world they had built. The year was the 1530s, and the Inca Empire, seemingly carved into the Andes like the mountains themselves, was already breaking apart. Civil war between the brothers Atahualpa and Huáscar had left the empire bloodied and distracted. Into this fracture stepped strangers from another world, men clad in steel, riding animals no Andean eye had ever seen, carrying weapons that spoke with thunder. They came not from neighboring valleys or distant mountains, but from across an ocean. Led by Francisco Pizarro, the Spanish conquistadors moved through the empire with the precision of a blade, finding its mark. Their arrival in the highlands of present-day Bolivia was not immediate. First came the fall of Cusco in 1533, the heart of Inca power. But conquest has a way of rippling outward. Soon the Spanish gaze turned toward the territories to the south and east. In 1538, they reached the Altiplano. Cities began to rise where none had stood before in European form. La Plata, later known as Sucre, was founded in 1538, envisioned as a seat of colonial administration and a hub for the wealth that would flow from the Andes. La Paz would follow in 1548, perched in a valley where the high winds soften and the air grows still enough to breathe without gasping. For the native peoples, the Spanish arrival was not merely a military defeat. It was the opening of a wound that would not close for centuries. The conquistadors brought with them a new order, one that valued gold and silver above all, that saw the land as a vault to be emptied and the people as a labor force to be used. The Spanish crown granted vast tracts of land to its loyal soldiers under the encomienda system, along with the right to exact tribute and labor from the indigenous population. In theory, the encomenderos were to protect and Christianize their charges. In reality, this system was often indistinguishable from enslavement. The Aymara, Quechua, and other groups who had once bent reluctantly to the mita of the Inca now found themselves facing harsher demands, enforced with foreign weapons and foreign laws. Missionaries followed close behind the soldiers. Crosses rose where huacas once stood. Temples were razed or repurposed as churches, their stones rearranged to tell a different story. To the Spanish, this was salvation. To the conquered, it was the deliberate erasure of their gods, their rituals, their very way of seeing the world. Yet the land itself resisted change. The mountains remained indifferent to banners and sermons. The icy winds still whispered the names of gods the priests tried to silence. And somewhere in those winds was the promise that no power, however vast, would last forever. The Spanish, however, had come to stay, and they had not yet seen the greatest prize these highlands held. In 1545, two Quechua men, Diego Gualpa and his companions, would stumble upon a mountain that seemed to glitter in the sun, a mountain that would draw the eyes of kings and merchants across the world. But that is the next chapter. For now, in the wake of the Spanish arrival, the old rhythms of the Altiplano began to dissolve. The llama caravans still crossed the mountains, but now they carried silver chalices and imported cloth. The festivals still filled the air with music, but the songs were now sung under the shadow of new gods. The Andes had seen empires come and go, but the empire now settling into its heights carried ambitions unlike any before. Ambitions that would reach deep into the earth, into the heart of a mountain, and into the lives of millions. The world of the Inca was gone. A new order had begun, and it was only just sharpening its tools. The year was 1545, when the legend began. On the slopes of a reddish-brown mountain rising above the barren Altiplano, two Quechua herders searching for lost llamas struck something that glinted in the thin, cold light. The mountain was called Sumaj Ortzco, the Magnificent Hill. but the Spanish would give it another name, Cerro Rico, the rich mountain. It was not a metaphor. Beneath its slopes lay veins of silver so thick they could be pried out with bare hands. Word of the discovery spread like wildfire through the colonial world. In the years that followed, Potosí grew from nothing into one of the largest cities in the world. A sprawling high-altitude metropolis perched at over 4,000 meters, where wealth and death walked side by side. The silver was destined for the farthest corners of the Spanish Empire. Coins minted in Potosí would jingle in the markets of Seville, pay mercenaries in Flanders, and find their way to China through Manila's galleons. The city became a heartbeat in a global economy, a heartbeat fed by human suffering. To feed the mines, the Spanish revived and twisted the Inca Mita system. Under colonial rule, this labor draft was harsher, its reach deeper. Tens of thousands of indigenous men from across the highlands were forced to leave their homes for months at a time to work in Cerro Rico's tunnels. They descended into darkness with only coca leaves to dull their hunger and fear, and a lamp to fight the suffocating night. Many would never return. Inside the mountain, air was thick with dust and mercury fumes. The temperatures swung wildly, freezing cold in some shafts, stifling heat in others. Accidents were constant: cave-ins, floods, explosions. Miners inhaled toxic dust until their lungs failed. Mercury, used to refine silver, poisoned their blood. Life expectancy for those drafted into the mines could be counted in years, sometimes months. The labor shortage was so great that the Spanish crown also sanctioned the importation of enslaved Africans to Potosí, torn from their homelands and marched into the thin air of the Andes. Many died within weeks from altitude sickness before ever setting foot underground. Those who survived faced the same fate as their indigenous counterparts: endless toil in the mountain's belly. Above ground, Potosí dazzled. It was a city of contradictions: grand churches and lavish mansions built on the backs of the dying, markets overflowing with goods from 4 continents, streets lit by the glow of silver wealth even as the mountain itself was being hollowed out. Spanish chroniclers boasted that Potosí was a city that eats silver for breakfast. Yet for the people who worked the mines, Cerro Rico was no gift from the gods. It was a devourer. In Aymara and Quechua belief, the mountain came to be seen as Tio, the spirit lord of the underworld, to whom miners offered coca, alcohol, and cigarettes in exchange for protection. But Tio's generosity was cruel. He demanded lives in return for silver. By the 17th century, Potosí's output had made it the jewel of the Spanish crown, but also a place where the earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of extraction. The mountain, once solid, was becoming a hollow shell. Its slopes were scarred, its heart cored out. The wealth of Potosí financed palaces in Madrid, wars in Europe, and trade with Asia. But here, at the source, the legacy was different. Villages emptied of men, widows left to tend frost-bitten fields, children growing up in the shadow of a mountain that had swallowed their fathers. In the cold air of the Altiplano, the silver sparkled as it left for distant ports. But for Bolivia's people, the mountain's shine was only the reflection of their own chains. Silver was not the only treasure the Spanish sought in Bolivia's highlands. They came for the soul of the land itself. Conquest, after all, was not complete until the conquered no longer remembered who they had been. In the wake of Potosí's rise, missionaries spread across the Andes like a second wave of invasion. Crosses were planted where sacred stones once stood. Temples to the sun and the earth mother were torn down. Their stones reused to build churches whose bells rang over fields where offerings had once been made to Pachamama. To the Spanish, this was salvation. To the people of the Altiplano, it was an unspoken funeral for their gods. The campaign to erase indigenous belief was methodical. Extirpación de idolatrias, the extirpation of idolatries, sent priests and officials into villages to destroy ceremonial objects, burn textiles woven with sacred symbols, and ban rituals that had ordered life for centuries. Festivals were repurposed as Christian feasts. Saints were assigned to guard the same mountains and rivers once watched over by ancient deities. On the surface, the people complied. Beneath, they whispered prayers to the old gods in the language of their ancestors, hiding their faith in plain sight. Alongside the cultural suppression came the displacement of entire communities. The Mita labor drafts for Cerro Rico and other mines did not simply take men away for months. They broke the continuity of village life. Families were left without fathers, sons, brothers. Crops withered in untended fields. In some cases, whole populations were relocated under the Mitmac system, an Inca practice now weaponized for colonial control. Communities from far-off valleys were uprooted and resettled near mines or estates, while others were scattered to prevent rebellion. To replace the countless indigenous lives lost to exhaustion and disease, the Spanish crown turned to Africa. Enslaved men and women were shipped from ports like Cartagena and Buenos Aires, forced on grueling marches into the highlands. For many, the transition from sea level to the oxygen-starved heights of Potosí was fatal. Those who survived found themselves trapped in the same darkness, breathing the same poison dust as the indigenous miners. The haciendas, vast estates controlled by Spanish and Criollo elites, became another site of coerced labor. Here, indigenous and African workers toiled in fields of maize, wheat, and coca, producing not for their own sustenance but for markets far away. The land that had once been communally held was carved into private property, its ownership recorded in foreign tongues. The Spanish language and Catholic catechism became tools of governance. Children were taught prayers before they could speak their mother's language fluently. Laws were written in a script that could not be read by most of the people they bound. Justice was a word that existed only in theory. In practice, it was defined by the needs of the colonial elite. Yet culture does not vanish entirely, even under centuries of pressure. The people of the Andes learned to weave their old beliefs into the fabric of the new order. A statue of the Virgin Mary might be dressed in colors honoring the earth goddess. A church festival might include dances that spoke in movement of ancient myths. Resistance became quiet, but it endured. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, Bolivia's indigenous majority lived in a world where their land, labor, and faith were controlled by outsiders. But memory is stubborn in the highlands. It hides in the folds of a woven cloth, in the rhythm of a drum, in the taste of coca leaves shared before a long day's work. The silver from Potosí flowed outward, feeding empires and enriching distant kings. But within Bolivia, a quieter, slower work was underway. The remaking of a people into subjects, their history rewritten, their gods renamed. And yet, somewhere beneath the surface, the old stories remained, waiting for the moment they could rise again. By the late 18th century, the Spanish Empire's grip on its American colonies no longer felt as unshakable as it once had. Wars in Europe drained the treasury. Rival powers, Britain, France, and Portugal, nibbled at Spain's trade routes and possessions. Even in Madrid, the gleam of Potosí's silver no longer shone as brightly. Centuries of over-extraction had begun to hollow out both the mountain and the empire that fed on it. In the Andes, these cracks in imperial authority became the wind that fanned old embers of resistance. Indigenous communities, long bowed under the weight of tribute, forced labor and cultural suppression, began to sense that Spain's attention was divided. Discontent, once whispered in kitchens and coca fields, now murmured in the open air of the Altiplano. In 1780, rebellion erupted in Cusco under Tupac Amaru II, a mestizo claiming descent from the last Inca ruler. His call for an end to the Mita system and for the expulsion of corrupt officials spread like wildfire through the highlands. Though centered in Peru, the uprising sent tremors deep into what is now Bolivia. It was here that another fire would be lit, one that would burn with a distinctly Bolivian voice. In 1781, Tupac Katari, born Julian Apasa, and his wife Bartolina Sisa rallied tens of thousands of Aymara warriors. Their cause was both political and deeply personal, to reclaim their land, dignity, and way of life. Katari took his adopted name in homage to Tupac Amaru and to Tomas Katari, another indigenous leader who had resisted Spanish abuses. That March, Katari's forces encircled La Paz. The siege was relentless. For over 6 months, Spanish troops and Criollo residents were trapped inside, cut off from food and reinforcements. From the surrounding hills, indigenous fighters tightened the noose. Bartolina Sisa commanded her own forces, organizing supply lines, overseeing strategy, and holding ground against counterattacks. For a time, it seemed the colonial order might fracture entirely. But Spain, wounded though it was, still had teeth. Reinforcements arrived from surrounding regions, breaking the siege. Katari was captured, brutally tortured, and executed by being torn apart by horses, a deliberate echo of Atahualpa's humiliation 2 centuries earlier. Bartolina Sisa met a similar fate, paraded through the streets before being hanged. The rebellion failed in its immediate goal, but it left a scar the Spanish could not erase. In its aftermath, colonial authorities tightened control, yet they could not erase the memory of months when La Paz trembled and the indigenous armies stood on the verge of victory. The names of Katari and Sisa became symbols, invoked in whispered prayers and future calls to arms. This period also revealed the fragility of the Spanish system. The same coercive labor and tribute structures that had enriched the empire now fueled its enemies. Every silver ingot shipped to Spain carried the bitterness of those who had mined it. Every field tilled under the encomienda sowed not only crops, but resentment. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Spanish Empire in the Americas was a wounded giant. Enlightenment ideas, revolutions abroad, and the empire's own mismanagement were converging into a perfect storm. Bolivia's highlands, cold, vast, and seemingly isolated, were in fact a powder keg, primed by centuries of exploitation and now surrounded by the sparks of rebellion sweeping the continent. In the thin air above La Paz, the winds still carried the cries of Katari and Sisa. They were gone, but their echo had found a permanent home in the mountains, waiting for the day when the fight for freedom would no longer be measured in months, but in final victories. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Spanish Empire in the Americas was like a great fortress with cracks running through its walls. The Napoleonic invasion of Spain in 1808 had toppled the Bourbon monarchy into chaos. In the colonies, the question was whispered and then spoken aloud, in plazas and taverns. If the king himself was captive, by what right did his viceroys and governors still rule? In the highlands of Upper Peru, as Bolivia was then known, this question was sharper, more dangerous. Centuries of exploitation had left the indigenous majority exhausted but unbroken, and a growing class of criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas, chafed under the privileges reserved for peninsulares born in Spain. The old order felt brittle, as if one strike could make it splinter. The first blow fell in Chuquisaca, modern Sucre, on May 25, 1809. Here, at the University of St. Francis Xavier, one of the oldest in the Americas, intellectuals and lawyers began to argue that sovereignty reverted to the people when the crown was in crisis. It was a legalistic idea, but under it beat a revolutionary heart. On that day, criollos and sympathetic militias ousted the local governor in what became known as the First Cry for Freedom. Only weeks later, in La Paz, the cry became a shout. On July 16, 1809, revolutionaries led by Pedro Domingo Murillo seized power and declared not allegiance to any European ruler, but the formation of a local junta, a self-governing body. Murillo's proclamation spoke of liberty and equality, words heavy with centuries of unfulfilled promise. For a moment, it seemed that Upper Peru might light the first fire of independence in South America. But empires rarely let such sparks grow unchecked. Troops from the Viceroyalty of Peru moved swiftly. By year's end, both Chuquisaca and La Paz were back under royalist control. Murillo was captured, tortured, and executed. Before his hanging, he is said to have declared, "The torch that I leave burning will never be extinguished." In the short term, the uprisings failed. Their leaders were dead or in chains. Their cities cowed under military occupation. The Spanish authorities worked to erase the memory of 1809, just as they had tried to erase the rebellions of Katari and Sisa. Yet, memory in the Andes is not easily erased. It lodges in the mountains and rivers, in the songs of the marketplace and the silence of the Altiplano nights. The revolts of 1809 were important for more than their immediate defiance. They revealed that the desire for self-rule was no longer confined to indigenous uprisings or whispered conspiracies. Criollos, mestizos, and even some mestizo-led militias had joined in open challenge to Spanish authority. The fight for freedom was becoming a shared language, even if its accents differed. Still, Upper Peru's road to independence would be longer and bloodier than most. Geography was both shield and prison. The high mountains made invasion difficult. But they also allowed royalist strongholds to survive here long after much of the continent had broken free. The mines of Potosí and the wealth they produced meant Spain would cling to the region with particular ferocity. After 1809, the Andes returned to their cold watchfulness. The streets of Chuquisaca and La Paz were quieter, but not at peace. The words of Murillo, that the torch would not be extinguished, became less a boast than a prophecy. For in the next decade, war would come not in sudden uprisings, but in campaigns that crossed mountains, rivers, and battlefields, carrying the dream of liberty from one end of the continent to the other. The time of isolated cries was over. The time of coordinated, relentless struggle was about to begin. The failed uprisings of 1809 had left Upper Peru bruised, but not broken. In the years that followed, the struggle for independence spread like a fire that would not die, flaring in one place, smoldering in another, always waiting for the wind to rise. Across the continent, figures like Simón Bolívar in the north and José de San Martín in the south were tightening the noose around the Spanish Empire. But here, in the highlands of Upper Peru, the war would be longer, bloodier, and more uncertain than anywhere else. Royalist forces clung to the region as if it were the last fortress of an empire in retreat. The silver of Potosí still flowed, and Spain would not surrender it easily. Armies marched back and forth across the high plateau. their banners snapping in the wind, their boots sinking into the thin dust of the Altiplano. Villages were caught in the middle, one week under Patriot control, the next under Royalist occupation. The fighting here took on a unique form. In the countryside, guerrilla forces known as Republiquetas harried Royalist troops, cutting supply lines, ambushing patrols, then vanishing into the mountains. These fighters, many of them indigenous peasants, knew the terrain better than any general. They fought not for a distant ideology, but for the hope of shaking off the yoke their families had borne for centuries. By 1824, the tide was turning. In the north, Bolivar's victories had broken Spanish power in what is now Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. In the south, San Martín had liberated Chile and crossed into Peru. But the decisive blow for Upper Peru would come from a man who was not Bolivian by birth, but who would forever be tied to its freedom. Antonio José de Sucre, a Venezuelan general and Bolivar's trusted lieutenant, Sucre was known for his calm under fire and his belief in discipline tempered with humanity. In late 1824, he led the Patriot Army into the highlands for what would become the defining battle of the South American Wars of Independence. Ayacucho. On December 9, 1824, on the rolling plain of Ayacucho in southern Peru, Sucre's forces faced the last major Royalist army in the continent. The thin air carried the smell of gunpowder even before the first volley was fired. The fighting was fierce, but the Patriot lines held. By afternoon, the Royalists were in full retreat. Their commander was captured, and with him fell the last great hope of Spain in mainland South America. After Ayacucho, Sucre marched into Upper Peru. Here, he moved not only as a conqueror, but as a founder. On August 6, 1825, in the city of Chuquisaca, the Republic of Bolivia was proclaimed, taking its name from Bolivar himself. Sucre became its first president, guiding the fragile new state through its first years. But independence was never a clean break. The mountains did not forget the centuries of forced labor. The mines still yawned open, and the divisions between elites and the indigenous majority remained as deep as the valleys. Sucre, an outsider, struggled to balance competing factions, and his presidency would last barely 2 years before he resigned, disillusioned by political strife. Yet for all the turmoil that followed, the moment of 1825 was real. After centuries of being a province, a colony, a conquered land, Bolivia had a name, a flag, and the fragile beginnings of sovereignty. In the streets of Chuquisaca, bells rang. In the markets, people spoke of a new dawn. And in the high silence of the Andes, where winds sweep over the ruins of Tiwanaku and the scarred slopes of Cerro Rico, the echo of that proclamation seemed to carry further than any shout of conquest ever had. The war was over. The struggle, in a different form, was only beginning. Bolivia entered the world in 1825, not with the confident stride of a new nation, but with the uncertain steps of a survivor emerging from a long captivity. The proclamation of independence had brought flags, speeches, and the promise of a future chosen by Bolivians themselves. But the echoes of war faded quickly, and the silence that followed was filled with questions for which there were no easy answers. The new republic inherited borders that were more lines on paper than realities on the ground. Its vast territory stretched from the snowbound ridges of the Andes to the green, humid lowlands of the east, lands difficult to govern and even harder to unify. Roads were few, communication slow, and the mountains that had sheltered rebels now stood as barriers between communities, meant to share a single destiny. Economically, independence had changed the flag above Potosí's Cerro Rico, but not the mountain's role. The mines, long the empire's heartbeat, remained central to the economy, but their output had already begun to decline. Centuries of extraction had eaten deep into the silver veins, and production required more capital than the impoverished new state could muster. The wealth that remained was unevenly distributed, controlled by a small elite descended from colonial encomenderos and merchants. The indigenous majority, Aymara, Quechua, and others, saw little improvement in their daily lives. The mita system had been abolished in name, but its legacy lingered in the form of high taxes, debt peonage, and continued dispossession from their ancestral lands. Freedom, for many, was a change in rulers rather than a change in reality. Politically, the republic was fragile from the start. Antonio José de Sucre, the first president, sought to build a modern state grounded in law, education, and gradual reform. But his position was precarious. As a foreigner, he faced mistrust from factions who resented leadership from outside Bolivia's own ranks. In 1828, wounded in an assassination attempt and weary of endless political intrigue, Sucre resigned and left the country, leaving behind a government vulnerable to the ambitions of generals and regional caudillos. In the years that followed, Bolivia became a stage for a revolving cast of leaders, many of them military men whose legitimacy came more from their command of troops than from the consent of the governed. Coups and counter-coups became familiar rhythms, and constitutions were written and rewritten in the hope, often in vain, of stabilizing the state. The young republic also found itself drawn into the ambitions of its more powerful neighbors. Bolivia's vast and ill-defended frontiers were tempting to those with stronger armies and clearer claims. Relations with Peru, Chile, Brazil, and Argentina were often uneasy, shifting between alliances and rivalries. Amid these challenges, there were attempts at nation-building. Schools were founded in urban centers, newspapers began to circulate, and new laws sought to bring order to the republic's tangled inheritance of colonial codes. But progress was uneven, and for much of the population, especially in rural areas, the state was a distant, almost invisible force, more likely to arrive in the form of a tax collector or recruiting officer than as a source of aid. The promise of 1825 had been real, but it was fragile. The mountains of Bolivia had seen empires rise and fall, and they now watched as this new republic struggled under the weight of its own contradictions. It was a nation still haunted by its colonial past, trying to write a future without the tools or the unity to do so easily. And yet, despite the instability, the idea of Bolivia endured. It lived in the colors of the flag, in the memory of the war for independence, and in the stubborn pride of its people. The first years of the Republic were not a golden age. They were a test, one that Bolivia would face again and again as it sought to survive in a continent where borders and fortunes could change overnight. Independence had given Bolivia a flag and a name, but not the power to keep all that the maps claimed as hers. In the decades that followed 1825, the young republic would bleed land, piece by piece, until the borders shrank to a shape far smaller than the dreams of its founders. The first great wound came in the War of the Pacific, 1879 to 1884. Fought against Chile over a thin, sun-scorched strip of desert along the Pacific coast, a region seemingly barren, but rich in nitrates, a valuable fertilizer in the age before synthetic alternatives. For Bolivia, the Atacama Desert was more than minerals. It was her only doorway to the sea. The conflict began when the Chilean government, backed by British investors, challenged Bolivia's attempt to tax a Chilean-owned mining company operating in its coastal province. What began as a dispute over tariffs spiraled into war, drawing in Peru as Bolivia's ally. Chile's navy swiftly cut off Bolivian and Peruvian forces from the coast, and its well-equipped army advanced northward with grim efficiency. Bolivia's troops, many poorly armed and trained, fought in the dry, blinding heat of the desert against an enemy that moved faster and struck harder. In 1880, after the crushing defeat at the Battle of Alto de la Alianza, Bolivia's government withdrew from the war, leaving Peru to fight on alone. The final peace treaty in 1904 confirmed the loss. Bolivia ceded its entire coastline to Chile, becoming permanently landlocked. The sea was gone. Generations would grow up knowing its color only from paintings and textbooks. Trade would now depend on the goodwill or the calculated self-interest of neighbors controlling the ports. The loss was more than economic. It was psychological, a permanent scar on the national identity. But the Atacama was not the only land Bolivia would lose. Earlier, in 1867, under the Treaty of Ayacucho, Bolivia had ceded more than 250,000 square kilometers of territory in the Amazon basin to Brazil in exchange for vague promises of friendship and trade. The jungles of this ceded land were remote, but they were rich in rubber, a fact that would become painfully clear in the rubber boom that followed. The Chaco War, 1932 to 1935, against Paraguay would cut deeper still. The Gran Chaco, a vast, sparsely populated expanse of dry forest, was believed, wrongly as it turned out, to sit atop oil reserves. Driven by this belief and by the desire to control the Paraguay River for trade, Bolivia launched a campaign against Paraguay, confident in its larger army and resources. Confidence turned to disaster. The Chaco's harsh climate, scorching days, freezing nights, and scarce water killed more soldiers than bullets. Paraguayan forces, acclimatized and better adapted to the terrain, outmaneuvered the Bolivians at every turn. By the war's end, Bolivia had suffered staggering casualties and ceded roughly 2/3 of the contested territory to Paraguay. Each loss reshaped the nation's sense of itself. The map grew smaller. The tone of official speeches grew more defensive. In the plazas of La Paz and Sucre, monuments rose to fallen soldiers, their faces cast in bronze, their gazes fixed toward lands they would never reclaim. For the indigenous communities of the highlands and valleys, these wars were often distant tragedies, fought in deserts and forests far from their homes, waged over resources they would never control. Yet the costs reached them all: higher taxes, conscription, and the lingering bitterness of seeing their country's borders retreat again and again. By the mid-20th century, Bolivia was a nation defined not only by its mountains, but by its absence. The absence of a coast, the absence of territories that might have been its wealth, the absence of victories in wars that had promised much and delivered little. And yet, through all this contraction, Bolivia remained. Land could be lost, but the highlands endured, and with them the stubborn persistence of a people who had learned over centuries that survival itself was a kind of victory. The borders had shrunk, the sea was gone, the jungles ceded, the Chaco lost. By the 1930s, Bolivia was a country whose geography felt smaller than the wounds it carried. But its internal fractures were larger than ever. The scars of war ran deep, not only across the land, but through the fabric of society. The early 20th century was an age of global industrial growth, yet Bolivia remained chained to the same economic patterns set in colonial times. Where silver had once been the lifeblood of the empire, tin now took its place. Rich seams of the metal lay beneath the mountains, and in the mining towns of Oruro, Yalagua, and Catavi, fortunes were made. But not for the miners who pulled the ore from the earth. A small elite of tin barons, Most famously, Simón Patiño, known as the Andean Rockefeller, controlled the wealth. Their influence extended from the mines to the halls of government, ensuring that Bolivia's economy revolved around exporting raw materials while importing manufactured goods. The profits flowed outward to foreign banks and the estates of the elite, while the miners lived in squalid camps, their lungs filling with dust, their wages barely enough to keep their families fed. In the countryside, the situation was worse. The majority of Bolivia's population was still indigenous, Aymara, Quechua, and others, bound to an agricultural system that looked much as it had in the colonial era. Large estates, or haciendas, dominated the highlands, worked by peasants who had little choice but to remain on the land. They paid rent in labor and crops, a system of pongage that kept them in a cycle of dependence and poverty. Political power remained in the hands of a narrow, urban, Spanish-speaking elite. The indigenous majority was effectively excluded from citizenship. Literacy requirements for voting, combined with the lack of schools in rural areas, meant that only a small fraction of the population could participate in elections. For most Bolivians, the state was not a source of protection or opportunity. It was a distant authority that appeared only to collect taxes, draft soldiers, or enforce order. The defeats in the War of the Pacific and the Chaco War only deepened the crisis. Each loss had been framed by the ruling class as a matter of national pride. But the burden of fighting and dying had fallen on the poor. When the soldiers returned from the Chaco in 1935, many found their old jobs gone, their debts unpaid, and their families hungrier than before. Resentment simmered. In the mining camps, strikes began to spread. Workers demanded better wages, safer conditions, and the right to organize. The elite responded with force. The most infamous example came in 1942 at Katavi, where striking miners were met with military gunfire. The massacre shocked the nation, but did not end the protests. If anything, it hardened the resolve of the working class. Meanwhile, the cities were growing. La Paz, Cochabamba, and Santa Cruz saw an influx of migrants from rural areas, seeking work and finding overcrowded neighborhoods instead. Here too, inequality was visible in every street. Colonial mansions standing only blocks from tin-roof shanties, private schools for the elite, while the poor sent their children to overcrowded public classrooms, if they could send them at all. By the 1940s, Bolivia was a land under pressure from within. The mines still roared, the haciendas still claimed the fields, but the old order was beginning to crack. The poor, the miners, the indigenous farmers, those who had carried the cost of war and loss, were finding their voice. What began as strikes and protests would soon coalesce into something larger, a revolution that promised to break the chains of centuries. But revolutions, like mines, are dangerous places. They promise riches, but they can also collapse, burying those who dig too deep. By the early 1950s, Bolivia felt like a mine shaft before the collapse. Cracks spreading through the walls, air growing heavy, pressure building in silence. The inequalities that had defined the republic since its birth were now impossible to ignore. The miners' strikes, the unrest in the countryside, the discontent of returning Chaco War veterans, all were converging into a single, combustible force. At the heart of this growing movement was the Movimiento Nacionalista Revolucionario, MNR, a political party that spoke of land reform, national control over resources, and the dismantling of the old oligarchic order. Founded in the 1940s, the MNR had drawn support from miners, middle-class urban workers, and indigenous peasants. Groups united less by ideology than by a shared exhaustion with the status quo. The spark came in April 1952. The sitting government, facing mounting protests, sought to prevent the MNR from taking power despite their electoral gains. The attempt backfired. Armed clashes erupted in La Paz, and the police sided with the rebels. The army, divided and demoralized after years of political instability, could not hold the capital. In just 3 days of fighting, the old regime crumbled. When the dust settled, the MNR assumed control, and Victor Paz Estenssoro became president. But this was not a coup in the traditional sense. It was a social revolution. The MNR moved quickly, passing reforms that reshaped Bolivia's political and economic landscape more profoundly than any change since independence. First came the nationalization of the mines. The tin barons, men like Simón Patiño, were forced to relinquish control of their vast holdings. The state created the Comibol, Corporación Minera de Bolivia, to manage the mining industry. For the first time, the profits from Bolivia's mineral wealth were, at least in theory, directed toward the nation rather than foreign investors and a small domestic elite. Next was agrarian reform. The hacienda system, which had chained indigenous peasants to the land in near-feudal conditions, was dismantled. Millions of hectares were redistributed to the campesinos who had worked them for generations. In villages across the Altiplano and valleys, land titles were handed out, a piece of paper meant to sever the centuries-old bonds of Pongalle. Perhaps most radically, the MNR extended universal suffrage. Until 1952, only literate Spanish-speaking men could vote. Now, for the first time, indigenous people, women, and the illiterate majority were given the right to participate in elections. In one stroke, the electorate expanded from roughly 200,000 to nearly 1 million citizens. The changes were sweeping, and in the streets there was celebration. Miners marching with their helmets gleaming in the sun, campesinos waving flags in town squares. But revolutions are never pure victories. Nationalizing the mines did not make them more productive. In fact, inefficiency and falling tin prices soon strained the state's finances. Land reform, while symbolic, often left peasants with plots too small or poor to sustain their families. The MNR itself began to fracture under the weight of its own promises. Armed miners' militias, once the revolution's backbone, became a challenge to the government's authority. Regional tensions flared, and as the Cold War deepened, Bolivia found itself under pressure from the United States, which feared the revolution might drift toward communism. Still, for ordinary Bolivians, 1952 marked a break with the past as sharp as any in their history. For the first time, the faces in government were not only those of the urban elite. The Quechua farmer, the Aymara miner, the mestizo shopkeeper, all had a formal place in the political life of the country. But the Andes are slow to change, and their shadows are long. Even as the revolution promised a new Bolivia, the old inequalities lingered, like the lingering dust of a mine explosion, invisible at first, but still deadly in the lungs. The next decades would reveal whether 1952 was the foundation of a new order, or simply another brief flare in the long, cold night of Bolivian history. The Bolivian Revolution of 1952 had promised a dawn. By the 1960s, many were beginning to wonder if it had only been a flash of light before another long darkness. The ideals of land reform, nationalization, and universal suffrage remained on paper. But the machinery of the state began to grind once again in the service of a narrower few. The alliances that had carried the Movimiento Nacionalista Revolucionario, MNR, to power fractured under the weight of competing demands, ideological rifts, and economic strain. As the Cold War deepened, Bolivia became a chessboard for larger powers. The The United States, wary of the MNR's more radical elements, began providing economic aid and military support in exchange for influence over policy. In this new geopolitical game, the revolutionary militias were disarmed, and the fervor of 1952 began to cool. The miners still labored in dangerous tunnels. Campesinos still struggled to make ends meet on small, unproductive plots. And the promises of the revolution seemed to fade into the high-altitude haze. The 1960s brought a cycle of instability that would define much of the century. Presidents came and went, some through elections, many through golpes de Estado, sudden military coups that toppled governments like pieces from a board. Political life became a revolving door. Victor Paz Estensoro, Hernán Siles Zuazo, René Barrientos, names that passed through the presidency with dizzying speed, each pledging reform, each constrained by a fragile economy and restless armed forces. One of the most emblematic figures of this era was René Barrientos, a military officer who seized power in 1964. His rule was marked by populist gestures toward the rural poor, yet also by brutal repression of labor unrest. In 1967, the Bolivian army, with U.S. assistance, captured and executed Ernesto Che Guevara, who had come to Bolivia to ignite a continental guerrilla movement. His death was a victory for the state, but it also deepened Bolivia's role as a pawn in Cold War politics. The 1970s ushered in an even darker chapter under Hugo Banzer Suarez, whose dictatorship lasted from 1971 to 1978. Banzer's regime was backed by the United States and regional allies, and while it brought a degree of economic stability through foreign loans, it did so at the cost of civil liberties. Political opponents were exiled, imprisoned, or silenced. The press was muzzled. Student and labor protests were met with tear gas, bullets, and disappearances. The apparent stability proved hollow. By the early 1980s, Bolivia was drowning in debt. The global recession and falling tin prices gutted the economy. When civilian rule returned in 1982, the country faced one of the worst hyperinflations in history. Prices doubling every few weeks, wages reduced to worthless paper before they could be spent. The miners, once the proud backbone of the revolution, found their livelihoods evaporating as Comibol collapsed under the weight of inefficiency and global market shifts. Tens of thousands were laid off, forced to leave the highlands for the cities or the coca-growing regions of the Chapar in search of work. This period was more than an economic collapse. It was the unraveling of the social compact forged in 1952. Trust in institutions, already fragile, disintegrated. For many, the state was once again an entity to endure rather than a force for change. In the highland markets, mothers sold what little they could spare to buy bread that would cost more the next morning. In the mining towns, abandoned shafts filled with water, swallowing the last traces of an industry that had once fed the world's hunger for metal. By the end of the 1980s, Bolivia was exhausted. The revolution's promises lay buried under decades of coups, authoritarian rule, and economic freefall. And yet, as before, the country endured. The mountains remained, indifferent to the passing of rulers. The people adapted, as they always had, waiting for the next shift in the wind, and the next attempt to wrestle meaning from survival. By the turn of the 21st century, Bolivia was a country still carrying the weight of too many unfinished promises. The scars of the revolution, the wounds of lost wars, and the memory of economic collapse had created a deep mistrust between the people and the state. The neoliberal reforms of the 1990s, privatizing industries, opening markets, had brought foreign investment, but also widened inequality. Many Bolivians, especially in rural and indigenous communities, saw their land, water, and natural gas handed to corporations headquartered far beyond the Andes. In the early 2000s, the pressure began to build again. Protests over water privatization in Cochabamba in 2000, the Cochabamba Water War, saw thousands take to the streets to demand control over the most basic of resources. The confrontation left one dead, hundreds injured, and a sense that Bolivia's sovereignty was not just about borders, but about who controlled its lifelines. Then came the gas wars of 2003. When the government proposed exporting Bolivia's vast natural gas reserves through Chilean ports, a reminder of the still fresh wound of the lost coastline, protests erupted nationwide. Roads were blocked, cities paralyzed, and in the highland city of El Alto, clashes with security forces left dozens dead. The unrest forced President Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada to resign and flee the country. From this turbulence rose a figure who would reshape Bolivia's political landscape: Evo Morales. A former coca grower and union leader from the Chapare region, Morales was Aymara, the first indigenous president in the nation's history. His election in 2005 was a moment heavy with symbolism. For the first time since the Spanish conquest, the highest office was held by someone whose ancestry reflected the majority of Bolivia's people. Morales came to power promising to reverse the neoliberal order. He moved to nationalize Bolivia's natural gas and oil, renegotiating contracts to ensure a greater share of profits for the state. Revenues from these industries funded social programs that reduced poverty rates, expanded education, and improved healthcare access. Internationally, Morales aligned Bolivia with other left-leaning governments in Latin America, challenging U.S. influence and advocating for indigenous rights on the world stage. Under his leadership, a new constitution was adopted in 2009, officially renaming the country the plurinational state of Bolivia, a recognition of the many distinct indigenous nations within its borders. The Constitution enshrined protections for indigenous languages, cultures, and communal land, and gave nature itself, Pachamama, legal rights. Yet Morales' presidency was also marked by deepening divisions. His critics accused him of consolidating power, undermining judicial independence, and disregarding constitutional term limits. His supporters saw him as a defender of sovereignty and dignity in a country long denied both. His detractors saw a leader unwilling to step aside when his time had come. The breaking point came in 2019 when Morales sought a fourth term, despite a 2016 referendum in which voters had rejected removing term limits. The election was marred by allegations of fraud. Mass protests erupted, met with violence and repression. Amid mounting pressure from the military and police, Morales resigned and fled the country, calling it a coup. His opponents called it a victory for democracy. What followed was a year of political instability under an interim government, marked by further unrest and deadly clashes. In 2020, elections returned Morales' party, the MAS, Movimiento al Socialismo, to power under President Luis Arce, a former finance minister. But the fractures remained between city and countryside, indigenous and mestizo, left and right, those who believed Bolivia's resources should serve its people first, and those who feared economic isolation. Modern Bolivia is a nation still in negotiation with its own past. It is a land where the echo of Potosí's silver still rings in the corridors of power, where the memory of lost seas and ceded jungles still shapes foreign policy, where the promise of 1952 and the protests of the 21st century are chapters in the same unfinished book. From the heights of El Alto to the salt flats of Uyuni, the air is thin but charged. Every breath carries the weight of centuries. And the question of what kind of country Bolivia will be when the next turning point arrives. Bolivia's story is not a straight line. It is a spiral, circling back on itself, each turn carrying echoes of the last. From the terraces of Tiwanaku to the silver veins of Cerro Rico, from the siege of La Paz to the mines of Catavi, the past is never entirely past here. It lives in the mountains, in the wind off Lake Titicaca, in the stones that once heard prayers to the sun and now hear the tolling of church bells. For 5 centuries, outsiders have come to Bolivia's heights with the same promise on their lips. Wealth, progress, destiny. They have carried banners, contracts, and flags. They have taken silver, tin, rubber, and gas. And in their wake, they have left not only empty tunnels and altered borders, but also a people who have learned that survival can be as great a victory as conquest. The mountains have seen it all. They watched the Inca roads bind the highlands to Cusco, only to see those roads turn to the service of Spain. They heard the clamor of Potosí's markets, where silver bought silk from China and wine from Andalusia, while in the tunnels beneath, men coughed away their lives in darkness. They heard the war cries of Katari and Sisa, of Murillo, of Sucre's soldiers at Ayacucho. They heard the silence of the sea after it was taken away, the stillness of the Chaco after its forests were seeded. Each time, Bolivia's map grew smaller, its wounds deeper. Yet each time the country remained, reshaped, diminished in territory, but not erased in identity. The revolution of 1952, the dictatorships of the 1970s, the water wars and gas wars of the 2000s. Each was another turn of the spiral, another attempt to redefine who holds power and who benefits from the land's riches. Today, Bolivia calls itself the plurinational state, a recognition that it is not a single voice, but many. Aymara, Quechua, Guarani, Mestizo, and others, all carrying their own histories, all bound to the same land. This is not unity in the sense of sameness. It is unity in coexistence, in the shared knowledge that the mountains belong to all and to none. But the challenges remain. Inequality still runs deep as the old mine shafts. Political divisions can fracture the country faster than any foreign war. The question that has haunted Bolivia since 1825, how to turn sovereignty into dignity for all its people, is still unanswered. The spiral keeps turning. And yet, there is something enduring in Bolivia's survival. A defiance in the way El Alto looks down upon La Paz like a guardian. In the way campesinos still work the same fields their ancestors did. In the way the miners still make offerings to Tio before entering the mountain's mouth. A sense that, though history has often been written elsewhere, the future is still theirs to decide. From the shadow of Cerro Rico's silver to the glare of the Uyuni salt flats, Bolivia's light has never been simple or unbroken. It is the light of a people who have known exploitation and betrayal, yet still lift their eyes to the peaks and imagine something better. In the thin air of the Andes, freedom is not a final destination, but a constant climb, steep, exhausting, and without a clear summit. But perhaps that is the point. The climb itself keeps the heart alive. The steps upward a quiet rejection of every empire, every map, every treaty that sought to define Bolivia without its consent. The spiral turns again. The question remains, and the mountains are still watching.